So in this video, we're going to start chapter 5, where we're going to be covering carbohydrates. And you can see here in this picture on the left, these are all sources of carbohydrates. So we've got potatoes, apples, legumes. These look like kidney beans here, rice, bananas, carrots. So fruits, vegetables, whole grains. And on the left here, we've got an animal source of carbohydrates, so honey. Okay, so here's our list of learning objectives, and as usual, I won't read these to you, but again, by the end, I hope that you can go back and understand each of these. Okay, so here we go. So we've seen this already now a few times in a few other chapters. We know that carbohydrates should constitute about 45 to 65% of our daily calories. Okay, so that's the AMDR for carbohydrates. Carbohydrates-rich foods provide essential nutrients. Carbohydrates are essential. They yield 4 kilocalories per gram, so they do have energy associated with them. They are the primary fuel source for our cells in our body, especially the cells of our central nervous system, so our brain, as well as our red blood cells and our muscle cells. This will be the primary fuel source. Regular intake of carbohydrates is necessary. You cannot live without carbohydrates. Okay, so food sources of carbohydrates. We looked at some of these in that first initial picture on that first slide. So we saw honey, right? So here is percent calories from carbohydrates, and so honey is just purely carbohydrates, right? It's made up of fructose and glucose. Syrup, like a maple syrup, same thing, 100%. Sugar, so common table sugar, which is also known as sucrose. Again, 100% sugar, 100% carbohydrate. It's a disaccharide. Banana, one medium banana, has a lot of carbohydrate in it. Baked potato. If we come down here to even dairy products like yogurt, a cup of yogurt has a pretty substantial amount of carbohydrates. Milk, peanuts, lower, but still some. If we come up here to soft drinks, soda, okay, so Coke, Pepsi, that's all sugar, okay? Very little to none other nutrients, okay? And as a reminder here, my plate, right, you should be rounding out your plate. Half of your plate should be fruits and vegetables, here shown in fruits are red and vegetables are green. Okay, both great sources of carbohydrates, but also have other nutrients as well. Grains here, again, good source of carbohydrates as well as other nutrients. Protein, our proteins generally our beans and legumes and some nuts will have carbohydrates, but we'll talk about how, meat, chicken, they're going to have no carbohydrates. And then here we have our dairy. Notice again how oils and other, should be limited in our diets. Okay, so sugar sweetened beverages, even honey. Honey does have some other nutrients in it, micronutrients in it, but again, for the most part, it's all just sugar. Okay. Okay. So we'll talk about sources and what kinds of sources are better than others throughout the chapter. So let's talk about the structure of carbohydrates first. So carbohydrates include sugars, so simple sugars, like the sugars that we find in soda, soft drinks, honey, common table sugar. Those are all in this category of sugar. We're going to call those simple carbohydrates. And then we have starch, which is a more complex carbohydrate, and then we have fiber, which is also a complex carbohydrate. And we'll define those in just a minute. Whether we're looking at sugar, starch, or fiber, they have the same elements. So they're going to be composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay. Plants are going to be our main source of carbohydrates. So, grains, beans, vegetables, fruits, even sugar, right, from sugar cane or sugar beets. That is all going to be from plant sources. There are animal sources as well. So again, honey would be our example of an animal source of carbohydrates. Okay. How do plants provide carbohydrates? They make them. So there is a process called photosynthesis that happens in green photosynthetic plants where glucose is produced through this process. So here in this figure, we can see the sun, right? The sun is going to provide light, which is a source of energy that the plants can absorb. So here's a leaf of a plant. They also absorb water through their roots, so from their soil, and they also take in carbon dioxide through structures in the leaf. Okay, so light energy, water, and carbon dioxide all end up in this photosynthetic organ, which again is the leaf, and those will be converted to glucose. Okay, oxygen in the process gets released, so that's given off into the air. Lucky for us, we need oxygen. Plants provide that as well. And then the sugar molecules produced will be converted eventually into starch. So all the glucose made will be converted into starch. And the starch can either be broken down by the plant and used, or the plant can store starch for later use. Okay. And so when we're eating fruits and vegetables, we're eating starch as well as fiber. Okay, so here's those terms, simple and complex. These terms, we're going to classify carbohydrates this way, and it's based on the number of sugar molecules present in the carbohydrate. Simple carbohydrates are commonly referred to as just simple sugars or just sugars. They're going to include both mono and disaccharides. Okay, and we're going to talk more about these on the upcoming slides, but for now, when you hear mono, you're thinking one, and saccharide means sugar. So these are molecules that are made up of just one sugar molecule. Okay, the formula for monosaccharides is here. So there's, for every carbon, there's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. So CH2O, and then here's the 6. So the monosaccharides that we're going to talk about are all going to be hexoses, so they're made up of 6 carbons. And then disaccharides, di meaning 2. These are going to be 2 sugar molecules linked together. Again, same simple formula, CH2O. All carbohydrates have that same formula. The number on the outside tells us how many sugar molecules there are, so double what we see in a monosaccharide. So there would be 12 carbons. Complex carbohydrates, these are the best carbohydrates to consume for multiple reasons, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. But complex carbohydrates are going to be made up of 3 or more sugar molecules joined together, and sometimes many, many more sugar molecules joined together. We call them polysaccharides. So poly meaning many, saccharide meaning sugar, polysaccharide. The 3 types that we're going to focus on are starch, which again, we just saw that on the previous slide. That's how plant cells store sugar. Glycogen, we'll talk about that. That's how animal cells store excess sugar. And then fiber is the last. Okay, so all 3 of these are complex carbohydrates. Okay, so let's start off with the monosaccharides. I'll give you a little bit more information. The most commonly found in food and in the body are going to be glucose, fructose, and galactose. And so those are the 3 we're going to focus on. There are other monosaccharides, but again, these are the 3 major monosaccharides. They are classified as what we call hexoses, which means that they contain 6 carbons. And so again, here's the formula, CH2O 6. Okay. Here are the structure of the 3. So here is glucose in a straight chain. In aqueous solution, so in our bodies and in food, glucose tends to take on the ring form. And so this is the same molecule, just in the ring form. So we got glucose, fructose. So you can see these are similar to each other. They're both made up of 6 carbon molecules. And you can see that they're structurally different from each other. Okay, so we've got glucose and fructose, very similar, but again, there are structural differences. And then lastly is galactose. Okay, and again, glucose and galactose look pretty similar to each other. The difference, there's a difference. Oh, where's my pointer? If we trace the molecule down, if this is carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, on carbon 4 you can see the hydroxyl group. I'm not sure if you guys know what a hydroxyl group is. OH group is on the other side of the molecule. And when we look here at carbon number 4, you can see that the OH group is above the ring. And so again, they're structurally different. It makes them different sugars. They're going to behave differently. Okay. Let's start with glucose. So again, glucose is a hexose, meaning it's going to be composed of 6 carbons. It's the most abundant sugar of the 3 in our diet and in our body. In foods, glucose is usually attached to another sugar, forming larger molecules. So we will find glucose as part of disaccharides, and we will also find glucose as part of polysaccharides. Okay, again, in food. In our bodies, when carbohydrates get broken down, they eventually become glucose. So they're broken down. If it's not glucose already, fructose and galactose are going to be transported to the liver, where they are actually converted into glucose. Glucose is referred to as our blood sugar. So when we talk about blood sugar, blood sugar spikes or blood sugar falls, low blood sugar, high blood sugar, that blood sugar, we're referring to glucose. So, again, the liver is going to send glucose out into the bloodstream, in response to hormonal signals, and that blood sugar is going to circulate throughout our body, supplying the cells of our body with energy. So again, glucose is going to be the major energy source. It is the preferred energy source, again, for the brain, as well as red blood cells and muscle cells. Really, all the cells in your body can use glucose, but again, it's the preferred source for the brain. Our cells can use other fuels. Our brain can as well to a certain extent, but again, glucose is the preferred. Okay, on to fructose. So fructose is going to be the sugar that we find in fruits, vegetables, honey, and we'll talk about high fructose corn syrup in just a second. Fructose is going to be, again, a hexose. It is going to be the sweetest natural sugar, so it does occur naturally. Again, it's found in fruits, vegetables, and in honey. Honey is actually 50% fructose and 50% glucose. And in processed foods, you've probably seen this on labels, like soda and processed foods. You'll see high fructose corn syrup, and we're going to come back to talking about high fructose corn syrup in just a bit. High fructose corn syrup is a processed sugar. It's a refined sugar. It's made up of fructose and glucose, just like honey is. But the range of glucose and fructose, there's a range. It could be 42 to 55% fructose and 48 to 45% glucose. Okay, so that's going to vary. High fructose corn syrup is sweeter than sucrose, which is common table sugar, and it's also cheaper. And so that's why a lot of times high fructose corn syrup gets added to processed foods. Okay, common table sugar is also made up of fructose and glucose. So, chemically, if we think about honey, high fructose corn syrup, and common table sugar, sucrose, they're made up of the same sugars. Okay, we're going to come back to that. The last type of monosaccharide I want to touch on is galactose. So galactose is over here. Again, it's an isomer of glucose. Still a 6-carbon sugar, so it's a hexose. Galactose doesn't occur in nature by itself, so we don't find it as a monosaccharide. When foods get broken down, galactose can be formed. Where we do find galactose is it joins with glucose to create what's called lactose, which is a disaccharide. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. You've probably heard of lactose. Lactose is found in dairy products, including milks and yogurts and things like that. Touch on that again in just a second. Okay, so disaccharides. So again, monosaccharides, one sugar. We've got glucose, fructose, and galactose. When we put two simple sugars together, we form a disaccharide. Okay, the process by which these are formed is called a condensation reaction. Okay, or sometimes it's referred to as dehydration synthesis, same thing. And so we can see if we look at the top here, let me move my picture. Okay, we have two monosaccharides, so 1, 2. You can see the plus sign here. We're going to put them together. We're going to remove water, and we end up with a disaccharide. Okay, so the first one that we're showing here is made up of glucose and glucose, so two molecules of glucose. We're going to put these together through a condensation, so we're going to remove water, and we form a disaccharide, so made up of two sugars, called maltose. And you can see linking those two sugars is something here called an alpha bond. Okay, it's a glycosidic linkage. It's a bond between two simple sugars. So maltose is a disaccharide, again made up of two glucose monomers or monosaccharides. We find maltose in seeds and in alcoholic beverages like beer and wine. The next one is sucrose. This one you guys are probably very familiar with. It's common table sugar, so the white stuff that you might put in your coffee. Sucrose is made up of two monomers, so it's a disaccharide, and those monomers again are going to be glucose and fructose. They're going to end up bonded together through the removal of water, and again here we have an alpha bond. Okay, so this is sucrose, two monosaccharides linked together by an alpha bond. Again, the sucrose is commonly referred to as just table sugar. Sugar cane, sugar beets, maple tree sap are all going to be sources of sucrose. Okay, now our bodies have enzymes that can break down these alpha bonds between these disaccharides. And so if we ingest maltose or we ingest sucrose, our digestive system produces enzymes that can break these down. Okay, we're going to talk about those specific enzymes a little bit later, but for maltose, it's called maltase, ASE, right? All enzymes end in ASE, usually. For sucrose, it's sucrase. Okay, on to lactose. Lactose, again, is a disaccharide. It's made up of one monosaccharide called galactose, which we just saw in the last slide, and then a monomer of glucose. Okay, again, these two get put together through the removal of water, so there's that dehydration or condensation, and we end up with this disaccharide called lactose. Notice the bond here. It looks very different from what we saw above, and if you look at the name, it's called a beta bond, not an alpha bond. Okay, where do we find lactose? Milk and milk products, so dairy. Here's the thing with beta bonds. Our bodies have a hard time breaking down sugar, carbohydrates in general that have beta bonds. So we're going to see these again when we look at fiber. Some people, after childhood, their levels of the enzyme that can break these bonds down, it's called lactase, it declines. And so over time, those people are not going to be able to break down lactose. And so if you're one of those individuals, when you have milk or dairy products that contain lactose, you get an upset stomach, bloating, gas. You have difficulty breaking these down. They end up in your large intestine where bacteria break them down. And those are kind of byproducts of bacterial digestion. Some individuals retain the lactase enzyme. That's called lactase persistence. That's genetic. And so some individuals can consume milk and dairy products throughout their life without a problem. Okay. I'm going to briefly mention oligosaccharides. And so oligosaccharides are more complex carbohydrates. They tend to be 3 to 10 sugar units in length. They include the two most common are raffinose and stachyose. We find these types of carbohydrates in vegetables like onions, cabbage, broccoli, as well as some whole wheats and legumes. And again, there is an issue with these types of complex carbohydrates in that there are beta bonds between the monosaccharides. And again, we lack the enzymes to break these down. Or some people lack the enzymes to break these down. And so they pass into our large intestine relatively undigested. And inside of that large intestine, bacteria that are in there, that are supposed to be in there, we'll talk about our microbiome. Or we talked about our microbiome in the last chapter. We'll talk more about it here. But those bacteria will break down the raffinose and the stachyose. And one of the byproducts of that metabolism is intestinal gas. Okay. There are enzyme preparations. You may have heard of Beano. Inside of Beano are enzymes that can break down these more complex oligosaccharides. And so if you take Beano before a meal that contains foods that have these oligosaccharides, that will prevent intestinal gas. So what will happen is these oligosaccharides get broken down before they get to the large intestine. And so you're not having that byproduct from intestinal microbes. Okay, so now on to the big ones, the polysaccharides. So we did monosaccharides. We talked about glucose, fructose, and galactose. And then we did disaccharides, 2 sugars joined together, right? And we talked about maltose, and we talked about sucrose and lactose. Okay, and then oligosaccharides a little bit longer. And now we're on to polysaccharides. So many, many, many sugar molecules long. These are long chains of glucose molecules, hundreds to thousands, all linked together by either alpha or beta bonds. We'll talk about the difference here. In food, polysaccharides will exist as either starch or fiber. And fiber we also can call cellulose. We're going to talk about each of these, but just as a precursor, so here is starch. This is the storage form of glucose in plants. So remember back to the photosynthesis slide, we said that plants make glucose during photosynthesis, and any unused glucose gets stored as starch. Okay, so that's what this starch is. So we find starch in plants like grains, legumes, tubers. Okay, there are 2 forms of starch that we'll talk about. Amylose, look at the structure, it's a straight chain. And then amylopectin, which is more of a branched polysaccharide. We will also talk about glycogen. And so glycogen, again, is a polysaccharide made of many glucose units. This is how glucose is stored in animals like us, specifically in our liver and muscle cells. Notice how glycogen, like amylopectin, is highly branched. Both starch and glycogen are considered to be digestible carbohydrates. Our bodies can break them down. Okay, we can break down starch during digestion. We can break down glycogen when glucose levels get low. Fiber, on the other hand, the last one, there's going to be beta bonds here. And so our digestive systems will lack the enzymes to break fiber down. So we consider this to be an indigestible polysaccharide. Where do we find fiber? Again, plants, but in specific locations. So leaves, stems, in the cell wall of plant cells. Okay, and we'll talk about the importance of fiber in just a second, but let's start with starch. Okay, so again, this is going to be a polysaccharide. It is the way that animals store excess glucose. It's a source of energy for plants, so they store it for later use. It's also a source of energy for animals. We eat it. We break it down. We use the glucose to fuel our cells. Okay, again, 2 types, amylose and amylopectin. Amylose is unbranched, right? It's just a chain of glucose molecules. Between each molecule are alpha bonds, so again, we can break this down. Amylopectin is highly branched, again, all alpha bonds. Amylopectin, because of its branched nature, is faster to digest, and therefore it releases glucose faster, and it has a faster effect on blood glucose levels. Okay, both of these are digestible sources of carbohydrates. So starch is a digestible form. All alpha bonds between the glucose molecules. When we break down starch, we break it down into glucose. And again, this is the main source of energy, of carbohydrates in our diet. We get starch from vegetables and whole grains, things like potatoes, grains, breads, pasta, legumes. Those are all really good sources of starch and other micronutrients in our diet. Oh, skipped a slide. Hold on there. Okay, glycogen. Glycogen, again, is a polysaccharide. It's made up of glucose monomers, again, all linked together by alpha bonds, so similar to starch. This is the way that humans and other animals store excess glucose. So we don't store it as starch, instead we store it as glycogen. Where do we store it? We store glycogen in our liver and in our muscle cells. It is highly branched, again, all alpha bonds, similar in structure to amylopectin. In the liver, so when blood glucose levels are high, the liver will store blood glucose as glycogen. In the muscle cells, again, same thing. Glycogen will be stored when glucose levels get low in those muscle cells. Glycogen will be broken down to free up glucose. Okay, so it's stored in both the liver and muscle cells. Again, when levels of glucose get low, either in the blood or in our muscle cells, it'll get broken down. Okay, and lastly, we have fiber. So this is our last polysaccharide. Fiber is different from starch and glycogen. It is not a storage polysaccharide. It's actually a structural polysaccharide found in plant-based foods. So again, it's structurally important to plants. It's not used as a store of glucose. The glucose here is going to be linked together by beta bonds. And notice the structure. They stack right on top of each other. So it's a structurally supportive polysaccharide. We do not contain the enzymes to break down the bonds between these glucose molecules, which again are called beta bonds. And so therefore, as fiber passes through our digestive system, it is not digested in the mouth or in the stomach or in the small intestine. We don't have the enzymes to digest it. When fiber gets to our large intestine, there will be bacteria, again, part of our normal flora, part of our normal microbiota, important to us, that will digest some of this fiber, not all of it. And when they metabolize this fiber, they produce two things, short-chain fatty acids as well as gas. And short-chain fatty acids are a fuel source, and they are thought to enhance intestinal health. And then gas is just a byproduct, okay? Most of the fiber that we ingest ends up becoming part of our fecal material. It remains undigested. Okay, a little bit more on fiber. Dietary fiber is the fiber, it's natural, so it's the non-digestible part of plants. It's found in, again, whole grains, vegetables, seeds, legumes, and fruits. There is also functional fiber. So if you think back to one of the earlier chapters, we talked about functional foods. Functional fiber is carbohydrate that's been extracted from some source, a plant or a whole grain or a vegetable or whatever, and it's been added to another food. And so you might see terms like cellulose, guar gum, pectin, psyllium on labels. And again, these are going to be functional fiber. They've been extracted and added to your food for some reason. Some of these may help with food consistency, or one thing in the United States and in other countries, we do have a difficulty meeting the adequate intake for fiber, and so fiber supplementation can happen. And so sometimes fiber is added to food to fortify it. Okay, again, that would be functional fiber. When you look on a nutritional label, you will see all of the ingredients. So these would be listed there. But when we look at total fiber, so dietary fiber right here under carbohydrates, dietary fiber is going to be, again, only what's found in natural foods. On food labels, that's what's there. Functional fiber, what gets added to the food, is not. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay, a little bit more on fiber. So we're going to see these terms soluble and insoluble fiber. Okay, so soluble fiber, soluble means able to be dissolved in water. Okay, soluble fiber is easily digested by the bacteria in our large intestine. It's found in citrus fruits, berries, oats, beans. These would be pectins, gums, mucilages, and some hemicelluloses. Okay, I'll show you some of those structures on the next page. These soluble fibers reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease. They reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes by lowering cholesterol and also blood glucose levels. Insoluble fiber, insoluble means they do not dissolve in water. These are not easily digested by bacteria. Again, we find these in vegetables, seeds, whole grains like wheat, rye, brown rice. The terms cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignins signify insoluble fibers. These are going to promote regular bowel movements. So again, these end up in fecal material and help you to have bowel movement. They alleviate constipation. They also prevent something called diverticulitis, diverticulosis, which we'll actually talk about in a few slides. Okay, so fiber is important. Here's just a quick figure. I don't need you to really worry about these structures so much, but just to show you, so cellulose is an insoluble fiber found in the outer skin, like an apple skin, whereas soluble fibers like pectins, gums, and mucilages, they're found in the flesh of the fruit. Okay, the same thing if I come over here, here's a seed, and so if I look at the outer layer, the bran layer, if we're looking at whole grains, lignin and hemicellulose, these are insoluble fibers. Okay, so make sure when you're eating, an apple, eat the skin. That's where the insoluble fiber is. And when you're eating grains, try to eat whole grains because again, processing will remove the bran layer. And that's actually on the next slide, I believe. Yeah. Okay, so grains are important, right? Grains are grasses that produce edible kernels, which we call seeds. Whole grains are better than processed grains. They retain all the grain parts, so the endosperm, the germ, as well as the bran, which is that outer shell that has fiber, and as well as other things. Whole grains are less processed. Again, they retain all parts, so they're higher in fiber. They're a better choice overall. Okay, just to give you some examples of foods that have soluble and insoluble fibers. So soluble fibers, so if we talk about pectins, we're talking about fruits. Pectins can be used as thickeners in jellies and jams. Some hemicellulose, like an oat bran, gums and mucilages, legumes, seaweed, psyllium. Okay, again, these are all soluble sources of fiber. They're going to, again, lower blood cholesterol levels, delay gastric emptying, so it takes longer to digest, decrease blood glucose levels. It's a slower release of glucose. Okay, and then again, insoluble fibers, so again, these are adding bulk to fecal material, decreases intestinal transit time, helps you to kind of get rid of waste faster, decreases constipation, lowers the risk for diverticular diseases and also colon cancer. So cellulose, found in the skins of fruits and vegetables, hemicellulose found in whole grains, and lignins found in seeds, in that bran and the bran layer of whole grains. Okay, so again, unprocessed whole grains are going to be better here for getting that insoluble fiber. Okay, a little bit more on this. So we mentioned that fiber-rich foods are going to reduce the risk of gastrointestinal diseases like colon cancer, hemorrhoids, constipation. Fiber-rich insoluble fiber is going to add bulk to feces, and it's going to give the muscles of your large intestine something to push on to expel that fecal material, to get it into the rectum. Secondly, fiber-rich foods are going to reduce the risk of diverticulosis or diverticular diseases in general. Diverticulosis is caused by trying to pass hard stools. And what happens is the intestinal wall, the large intestinal wall, becomes weakened, and it causes these bulges. So if I look over here on this figure, this is the lumen of the large intestine. And so here is the intestinal wall, and here is that bulging, which we call a diverticulum. When that happens, it can become inflamed and infected, and food can get caught in there, bacteria can get in there, and that's not good. And so, again, having a fiber-rich diet is going to prevent those. Okay? A fiber-rich diet also reduces the risk of obesity. Fiber-rich foods tend to be lower in calories. So think fruits, vegetables, whole grains. They tend to be lower in calories, and they can absorb water, so they keep you feeling fuller longer. So they play a role in satiety. They keep you satiated for longer. These types of foods also reduce the risk of heart disease. They delay or block the absorption of cholesterol from the small intestines. They also decrease the risk of type 2 diabetes by slowing digestion, slowing the release of blood glucose into the bloodstream. You have enhanced control of blood glucose levels. There aren't these huge spikes and drops. Okay. All right, last slide here. The adequate intake of fiber for adults is 25 grams per day for women, 38 grams per day for men. Most Americans only get about half of the recommended amount of fiber, so we're really low. Again, fruits, vegetables, and whole grains are more healthful carbohydrate choices than foods with added sugar because they have fiber and because they have complex carbohydrates. Okay, so always try to go for complex carbohydrates over simple carbohydrates. Always try to go for fiber-rich foods that are also rich in complex carbohydrates rather than empty calories, added sugars. Okay, more to come later.